Good day everyone. For this video, we are going to make a textual analysis in the second chapter, pages 6 to 7 of the book entitled Pride and Prejudice. Just to give you a little background of the author and the story before I proceed to the analysis, this book was written by Jane Austen. She was an English novelist and she was born in Steventon, England in 1775, where she lived for the first 25 years of her life. Fun fact, this book was originally titled First Impressions, but to avoid duplicating the title of her other book that she published in 1800, she decided to change its title to Pride and Prejudice. She began writing this book in October 1796 at the age of 20 and completed it in August 1797, just 10 months later. His father, on the other hand, George Austen, believing that her work is worthy of publication, wrote a query letter on November 1, 1797 to London publisher Cadell and Davis. Austen's offer was, however, rejected by return mail. Nevertheless, Jane continued to write, and based on the success of her first novel, she was offered £110 sterling for the copyright to her book Pride and Prejudice by Thomas Egerton, and it was published in 1813. Pride and Prejudice is a fiction, classified as a romantic novel, and the plot follows the turbulent relationship between Elizabeth Bennet, the daughter of a country gentleman, and Fitzwilliam Darcy, a rich aristocratic landowner. This novel was set in rural England at the turn of the 19th century, and it follows the Bennet family, which includes 5 very different sisters. The eldest was Jane, and she was sweet-tempered and modest. She is also Elizabeth's confidant and friend. Elizabeth, on the other hand, is the second daughter, and as we all know, she's the heroine of the novel. She's intelligent and high-spirited, and she shares her father's distaste for the conventional views of society as to the importance of wealth and rank. Now, the third daughter is Mary. She's plain, bookish, while Lydia and Kitty, the 2 youngest, are flighty and immature. For this video, again, we're not going to make a full book analysis. We'll only focus on the second chapter of the book, pages 6 to 7. Now, my partner is going to examine its graphological and phonological features. I, on the other hand, will examine its lexicosemantic features and its syntactic features. Now, let's get down to the analysis. My partner will go first.
6 and 7 contains 489 words, and the point of view is always on the third person. It was unseemly for ladies to look for an immediate prelude to men. So Mr. Bennet should at first go about as the middle person. Mr. Bennet's visit shows that even he perceives the significance of making a match, an early indication of Mrs. Bennet's whimsical person. She can snap from objection to endorsement. Wonderful manners of speaking, such countless sharp perceptions, and such office with moving energy proficiently and effortlessly in her verbal developments. What's more, she consolidated areas of strength for that with a wonderful verbal familiarity and office. She had the option to move a ton of energy in somewhat a couple of words when she needed to. Fascinating to take note of how she planned her sections additionally. She regularly changes, for instance, a blend of long complex sentences with short explanatory articulations, making the impact of emotional substance moving along quickly just to be summed up and accentuated with a definitive punch toward the end.
The phonological level, Fox form for emulating Mrs. Bennet's tone is much striker than Savage's quick and little feeling pattern, in light of the fact that Fox is better at communicating the variety of beat and intonation, and the treatment of interruption. For example, in and a portion of his workers are to be in the house toward the finish of next week. Fox adaptations dials back the speed deliberately at the spot toward the finish of the next week, demonstrating Mrs. Bennet's gives specific consideration to the appearance time, and in this manner audience can grasp Mrs. Bennet's fervor to longing for appearance day, Mr. Morris' appearance. In Savage's version, through the speech, the close-to-home progression of Mrs. Bennet can't be so generally welcomed for its, for the most part, consistent speed, aside from the finish of the sentence, high pitch for 1 week from now.
Now, at the lexicosemantic level, we can observe that the author used unfamiliar words and the reader might have difficulties in understanding the message in the text, so it demands a careful analysis for their meanings to be properly decoded. Take the sentences for example. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman and I have no opinion of her. So the word selfish, we are somewhat familiar with this word, right? It is a person who only cares for his or her own. Now, the word hypocritical, it's not that familiar. So here, Mrs. Bennet was talking about Mrs. Long, right? And the word hypocritical refers to someone that acts in contradiction to his or her stated beliefs or feelings. Here, this sentence. Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but, unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. So, deign, the word deign is not really familiar for all of us, right? And deign in Cambridge Dictionary meaning it is to do something unwillingly or in a way that shows someone think they are too important to do it. So Mrs. Bennet shows arrogance or she's being conceited, right? Now here Kitty has no discretion in her cups that her father times them ill. So here we have two difficult words. First is discretion, meaning individual's choice or judgment. And the second word is ill. Here the word ill is an example of a lexical relation under heteronyms where some words spell the same but with different meanings. First, ill could be a person who is not in good health or he's sick or something, and ill could be something that is not suited to circumstances or not to one's advantage. In the sentence, the latter is the appropriate meaning, right? Now, Kitty replied, "I did not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty fretfully. So, here Kitty was feeling irritated because it's not as if she wanted to cough for fun, or maybe she really wanted to do that, but she just didn't have a choice. Still under lexicosemantic level, idiomatic expression, we can also see and hear in this passage some idiomatic expressions. From the start of this chapter, we knew that Mrs. Bennet and her daughters were wishing that they could be introduced to their neighbor, right? Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bennet, without their knowledge, has already been introduced himself to Mr. Bingley, but he was just pretending to his wife and daughters that he is not, as he very much enjoys teasing his wife. This passage is immediately preceded by this exchange, "I will take it on myself." So from this, we can see that Mrs. Bennet is so desperate to introduce her daughters to Mr. Bingley, and that is via Mrs. Long and her family. However, she wasn't around. Therefore, they won't be able to do the introductions. Mr. Bennet then begins to reveal the truth, and that is, has already made the acquaintance of the new neighbor by saying that his wife will be able to introduce Mr. Bingley to Mrs. Long. But Mrs. Bennet doesn't understand how is that possible because she hasn't met Mr. Bingley herself. Then her husband, Mr. Bennet, knows very well what she means and that she's confused, but he pretends that she's being very discerning and making a clever comment about how she cannot possibly knew Mr. Bingley well, as she will only have known him for 2 weeks by the time of the ball. So the office, this word, the office, that Mr. Bennet is talking here is about the task of introducing Mr. Bingley to Mrs. Long at the ball, and that will take place in 2 weeks' time. So he says that he will introduce Mrs. Long to their new neighbor. He will take on the responsibility himself. He does this because if he doesn't, someone else will. And the absence of Mrs. Long and her, maybe presumably single daughters, must also be given the chance to meet their new eligible bachelor neighbor, which is Mr. Bingley. Another example is, "What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation?" cried he. So the word cried here is not literally crying or like Mr. Bennet is crying. We can just say exclaimed Mr. Bennet, something like that. This sentence as well here shows the idiomatic expression, especially this one, "for heaven's sake." The term is euphemistic, and it is an expression of surprise, emphasis, expiration, outrage, and so forth. So the term carries no literal meaning of its own, but it expresses a strong degree of exasperation. Here, Mrs. Beneth wants to show that she is annoyed about Kitty coughing. That's why she used this term. This phrase as well has no literal meaning. It doesn't mean that Kitty's coughing can cut Mrs. Bennet's ear literally or its nerves. It is an idiomatic expression that means to cause great damage, disorder, or ruin to someone or something. We're down to the last features, the syntactic features. The viewpoint of this book is usually described in a third-person point of view, meaning Austen or the author has the power to tell us everything that's going on. What we have here is the authorial voice narrating the story. However, although the story is narrated in a third-person form, there is no omniscient authorial voice. So, meaning everything that the author narrates is from the perspective of one character or another. So, at the syntactic level, the opening narration in this chapter presented in simple and compound complex sentences. For instance, simple sentence because it only contains a one independent clause. We have a subject, which is Mr. Beneth, and a predicate. Then the next sentence, one independent and two independent clause is example of a compound complex sentences. Also, as we can observe here, the author sometimes wrote lengthy sentences and are just separated with multiple commas or semicolons, and we can notice that the entire passage is just a single sentence. Here, okay, as we can observe, this is just a single sentence, but it is separated by multiple commas and semicolons. Moreover, Austen, the author, also liked to repeat patterns which we have known as anaphora. She used she to start two phrases in a couple of sentences. She has two nieces of her own, and she is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her. Although she does not state it directly, we know that Mrs. Bennet is referring to Mrs. Long, right? Okay, at the level of discourse, certain cohesive ties are used to hold the text together lexically. This include referential cohesion. Now, this example, so we start from here. This is a case of anaphoric reference, and that is a backward reference where him anaphorically refers to Mr. Bingley. There are also anaphoric reference in the following sentences. Mrs. Long and her daughters must stand their chance, and therefore she will think it an act of kindness. Her and she anaphorically refers to Mrs. Long. And also here, Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him. So him here anaphorically refers to Mr. Bingley. Now let's go to elliptical cohesion. Now, elliptical cohesion is the case of recoverable omissions and substitution by zero. This sentence, for example, Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. She began scolding one of her daughters, so she was being omitted. Lastly, in this passage, we can also see lexical cohesion. There are four varieties of lexical cohesion, but here in this passage we can examine one, and that is repetition. Take this for example. The girls stated their father, Mrs. Bennet, said only nonsense, nonsense. So the word nonsense was being repeated, and the second sentence, impossible, was also being repeated. There are still a lot of features that we weren't able to examine, but I hope you have learned something from our video. Thank you, and once again, good day.